Welcome back, viewers. Thank you again for your patience and for staying with us. We finally have Dr. Wallace. We are able to hear him now, and we will get right into our conversation. Before we do that, a quick shout out to Ajay Allen, one of our viewers. Ajay, we see you are online, and thank you for being with us this morning. Dr. Wallace, good morning, sir.
Pleasant good morning to you. Despite all the challenges, it's really a pleasure to be here to try to share some information on this insidious act that we're having in Tobago.
Yes, definitely. And of course, a man who, with your academic qualifications and your experience, this conversation, I was telling our viewers while we were sorting out that issue that you are well qualified and equipped to have this conversation with us this morning. And right away, I just want you to briefly tell our viewers, what is a criminologist and what do you do?
Oh, well, as a criminologist, it's a big task, but basically it involves teaching and research. So
Right.
we try to impart knowledge to the younger generation, to our students, on what is crime, what are the causes of crime, what are some of the potential solutions. So it's a whole range of things we do, from the theoretical to the practical, right? That's the basic layman perception as to what is a criminologist and what we do. But a greater part of my task involves conducting research on all aspects of crime and criminal activities.
Hmm. And I know your research would have covered this span, of course, not just gang violence, but domestic violence as well. But I want us to tap in quickly because of the time we have on Tobago's situation. I would have mentioned earlier that if Tobago had one murder or major crime, that was one too much. Now we are well over 15, and it seems to be becoming quite commonplace here on the island, which is something we are not used to. And though there may be many factors, based on your research, what do you think accounts, or what have you discovered is accounting for this change on the island?
Well, that's a really interesting question. It's a good question. It's a tough question. Indeed, I've conducted research on Tobago, looking at the murders, especially that are occurring in Tobago. Mm-hmm. And in fact, approximately 2 to 3 years ago, right on this program, I indicated that if we do not take stock of what's happening, then that murder rate, which was at the time around the 9 or 10, that it would certainly create a record in terms of Tobago. But basically, the research has shown that there are several factors, what I call a conflation of factors that contribute to what's happening in Tobago at this point in time. And the first thing I'd like to touch on is our really porous borders. Our borders in Trinidad and Tobago are really weak. At one point in time, we had the Police Marine Branch, which supported the Coast Guard. So there were 2 layers of protections for borders. Now, it's very easy to breach that.
Right.
You have fishermen leaving from Tobago and going to other Caribbean islands and returning with firearms. Then you look at that, the port itself. You have numerous illicit goods that are being moved through the port. And one of my colleagues, Gavin, here just last night, he was mentioning that we need to strengthen the security on the port to deter these type of activities. Then you can look at the movement of gangs. And the movement of gangs it's a regional problem.
Right.
You have gangs that are affiliated to the different gangs in Trinidad and Tobago, the different numbers. They are in Trinidad and Tobago, Barbados, Jamaica, Curacao, you name it. Then if we look at other structural issues, you have people leaving school, secondary school without skills. So they're not academically qualified and they have no skills whatsoever. You can look at, for example, poor parenting practices. You can look at the desire now for instant gratification rather than delayed gratification. Yes. You can look at the employment level in Tobago, which is something Dr. Anders James has always spoken about. So there's a whole range of factors. In essence, I cannot point to any one factor. As I said, it's a whole range of factors.
Mention some interesting factors. And again, every time we have these conversations, it doesn't matter who we speak with. These are the factors that would pop out and stand out. And my thing is, especially where the factors seem to be factors that can be controlled or changed over time. And when I say over time, I'm not talking about like very long term, but short to medium term. For example, we've always heard about the challenges of our porous borders. And Tobago, of course, a small island surrounded by water. Many of our villages are known as fishing villages. There's easy access to pirogues, vessels to make a trip back and forth. Why can't the authorities clamp down on this? This is something we have been hearing time and time again.
And yes, you are so correct. It is something that I've been asking from 2010. I've been asking, why don't we have a functional police marine branch? So in my estimation, it has a lot to do with political will.
Right.
Right? For example, one of the questions that I've always asked, we have Little Tobago. Little Tobago is we have a lot of tourists visiting the island. When last have we had police officers actually visiting Little Tobago, conducting patrols? We have Monas Islands, Carrera Island.
Right.
We have all these islands, these landforms off the coast of both Trinidad and the Tobago. And I've always said that what we have is land-based policing. If something were to happen on one of these islands, let's suppose someone goes to Little Tobago and they're victimized there, how would the police in Tobago get to Little Tobago?
Right.
So that solidifies my point that what we have is land-based policing. And what we really need is to put the best minds together to come up with a long-term strategic policing plan, one that transcends the Commissioner of Police. And by that I mean we include the Commissioner of Police, but whenever the Commissioner of Police changes, that plan remains intact. And that's what we need. Crime is not a short-term issue. Crime did not get here over time, as you rightly alluded to.
Right.
So therefore, stopgap measures and putting plasters on sores will not alleviate, they will not address the problems that especially Tobago face today.
And, there are so many different theories. Some of them might be, as we say, old talk, etc. But, and this is not just unique to Trinidad and Tobago, but many times you hear the opinion that no government really wants to stop crime because there is that generation of income. You are also alluding to those who may be in the upper part of society who are also connected to the crime going on. So you hear a lot of talk about no government really wants to interfere with that industry. And, and whether that is so, because that could just be speculation. You're talking again about the police force, and I always say sometimes I get the impression that, TTPS, and yes, they are hardworking, the system seems quite reactive, because you hear people talk about what may be going on in their villages or communities. And of course, the police can't just go and arrest someone on hearsay. But are stings being developed? Are people being watched? Is there a long-term plan? Okay, we've heard so much hearsay about person X. That's definitely a person of interest. And if they are doing so, we the citizens don't really see much outcome. You may hear about one or two persons being arrested because they would have, been looking at this person's movement or some investigation. But really, capping down and getting more intel on persons of interest. And I think that is an area that maybe our TTPS can, really improve on so that we can see more. You also mentioned the movement of criminals. And I want us to talk about that a bit because in time past, you would hear in Tobago when the violent crimes, the murders were happening one, you would hear a lot of people here say, the criminals are not from Tobago. The criminals are coming from Trinidad. Do you think because we have had that thought and that approach, we may not have been as proactive as we should have, and it may have brought us to this point when we realize, hey, the criminals are right here?
All right. So again, two really interesting questions there. Um, the first has to do with the utility of crime. Crime has a utilitarian component in it. And quite rightfully, as you alluded to, there are some persons who may not really see anything, or they may tend to look the other way because crime is utilitarian, right? You have, and I'm not pointing any fingers here, mind you, but if you look at the landscape, there are certainly people who benefit from criminal activities, right? And what is needed in the context of what you mentioned is a more proactive policing. Now, policing will always have that element of reactivity in it, right? In that an accident will happen, someone may commit an offense. You'll always have that element of reactivity in policing. But what we need to do is enhance the proactive component of policing. So we need to have more police officers on the ground, but not only having them on the ground for having them on the ground sake, or having them on the ground simply controlling, conducting patrols. We need to go beyond that. And certainly one of the things that you mentioned, intelligence gathering. Policing has to move from what I call net fishing, from constantly having roadblocks here, there, and everywhere.
Right.
You have people who, they're passing through the roadblocks. You have apps that they will tell you where you have police roadblocks.
Right.
So while operations and while roadblocks are one tool within the toolbox of policing, we need to be more we need to be more proactive. So we need to be more data driven.
Right.
We need to have more intelligence gathering and usage of intelligence among the agencies. One of the things that we have in Trinidad and Tobago, one of the things that we are good at in the Caribbean is having a multiplicity of agencies.
Yes.
Doing the same thing. They're all gathering data, but
Yes.
how much of that data that is gathered is being shared, and how much of that data is being used in a sort of proactive measure to go after these criminals. So,
Right.
so yes, I agree with you there. We really need to enhance our intelligence gathering capacity.
Mm-hmm. And it leads us again to the question of now the ordinary person, the person like me, who, is living in a village, living in a community, living in a neighborhood, and you are seeing changes happening around you. And sometimes you feel as though you are not empowered and you don't want to say anything. Now, this is very hypothetical. I don't want anybody coming for me, you don't want to say anything because in a small society, one of the challenges we have here in Tobago, you have heard people speak about their experiences, is that even though you may make a report, that person you're reporting is related to somebody in the station, and before the report is done, you are labeled in the community as a snitch or whatever, and sometimes, there's a spin-off from that, and now your life is impacted, and some people just rather not say anything. How do we deal with an issue like that?
But from my perspective, that's a twofold sort of, it's a twofold situation. Indeed, you have some people who are willing to speak to police officers. And I speak from a position of knowledge, right? That there are people who are quite willing to speak to police officers, but they do not wish to do so openly. They do not wish to go to the police station. In some instances, they are labeled as snitches, or in some instances, the information that they give to the police gets back to the criminal element, and their life is now in danger. That's a reality.
Right.
But the other side of the story is that people often use that as an excuse not to report things.
Right.
And it's only when it hits home to them that they are asking other people to report. There are many ways that people can report crime and criminal activities to the police. Right? There are many ways you can do that. You can call some of the anonymous lines. In fact, you can go as basic as even writing letters. Right? Mm-hmm. There are different ways that we can use to get information to the police. And again, I'm speaking from a position of knowledge, having myself done various things within national security, and knowing that there are many ways that one can report. But as I'm saying, it's a twofold sort of situation. We have to be cognizant of the reality, but we also have to understand that there are many different ways that we can report crime to the police in Trinidad and Tobago. In fact, a good intelligence officer, there are a whole range of things that we can do. Now, I don't know if the average individual like yourself, as you rightfully alluded to, I'm not certain if the average individual knows about some of the different ways that people can report.
And education is so important because we know knowledge is power. And many times assumptions are made. So even, the TTPS, they understand the system and they may just think, hey, people should know this, but reality is many may not know it, and maybe a little more information shared along those lines can go a long way. Now, I know a lot of your research focused on gang violence as well, and I want us to look at the school factor, the home factor as well, because there's this deep connection between school and home, although many times people may try to separate it, but it's definitely intertwined. And when we look at gang violence, what exactly are we speaking about, and how has that influenced the escalation of crime here in Tobago?
So when you look at gang violence, basically, there are several, you can find several definitions for gang violence. This is not an academic forum, but, in order for people to understand what you're dealing with, gang violence basically looks at criminal activities that are performed in a structured way when you have 2 or 3 persons acting together over a period of time, right? And that encapsulates what's known as gang activities, and out of that you find gang violence. And gang violence is broad. It can range from extortion, robbery, kidnapping. So it's a wide range of activities that encompass gang violence. Now, what's happening is that in the past, when crimes were committed in Tobago, we pointed fingers at the larger island. We pointed fingers at Trinidad and said, the criminals are coming from Trinidad, they're migrating to Tobago and committing offenses. Now, that's partially true, right? You have what's known as crime migration and gang migration. That's partially true.
Right.
But again, I've always mentioned that we do have homegrown criminals in Tobago, and we need to start looking within. Societies in Tobago are relatively smaller than in Trinidad, and therefore people will have information within the community as to what's occurring. Now, information is different from evidence.
Right.
So quite often people will tell you, well, we know who did that.
Right.
But that's just information. Unless you go to the police and give them that information, which is backed up by evidence, then the police are more or less hamstrung, because we still in Trinidad and Tobago depend heavily on what we call IC witnesses, or persons who would have seen the commission of a crime.
Right.
Right? So we need to move beyond that. Further, in a time gone past, in every community in Tobago, the common man, the average individual, investigated every stranger who came into the village.
Yes.
Again, I know it for a fact. I was part of one of those communities, one of those rural communities. And whenever somebody strange entered that village, we all, everybody, we got together and we wanted to find out who is that person, where that person come from. So the first layer of protection actually comes from the community, right? Now, we also need to look at the criminal justice.
As you mentioned, that community, life has changed so much for us here that we live in isolation, because I think that is such a unique way to protect our communities, to know who is coming, who is going. And we're not talking about getting, as we say in colloquial terms, being fast, but in this case, the fastness provided a protection, for the community. But now you have more people leaving the home to go to work, spending more hours out more than, in. And you may see a strange car, you may see a strange person, but that's not my business. So I'm not going to get involved. We have really changed how we live. There are some communities right here, people don't know who's living next door to them. And that was not so.
Hmm. And again, you're quite correct. And what that leads to is that lack of knowledge actually facilitates criminal activities. And that leads me to something that I've always spoken about, community empowerment. If you empower every community to deal with issues that are local to them, so that in Crown Point, you have the Crown Point Community Council, the Castara Community Council, Charlottesville Community Council. And these councils are not only looking at criminal activities, but they are looking at how can we develop our communities. So you look at it from a financial position.
Right.
You empower communities from a financial position. You empower them from a social position, from a religious position. So community empowerment, in my view, is at the root of weeding out some of the activities we see in Tobago, the criminal activities. But I want to stress that the community empowerment model doesn't only lie in looking at crime.
Right.
It looks at empowerment in a broader sense. And when you empower communities in that broad sense, then you find issues like crime, which falls under the community. You know, people take a more intimate and a more personal responsibility for it. So we need to start empowering our communities, not only in Tobago, but in Trinidad and Tobago.
Right. And it's very important, again, that we understand that we do have some power, but we need to be proactive, not just the TTPS needs to be proactive. And on the island, of course, I know some people are listening and they're saying, but we do have village councils, and yes, we do this and we do that. But it's about widening the scope, understanding your power as a village council, as villagers, as community members, and really putting being intentional. When I had a conversation with Pastor Dutton quite recently about crime as well, you know, he raised the point about being intentional. So many times we have awesome conversations. We know all the factors that contribute to crime, but what are we going to do about it? And unfortunately, our time is just about out. But I would have to ask our producer, because I want us to talk more and really, you know, in your findings, what are some of the solutions? What can we implement? Because it's so easy to talk about the ills of it and how it has happened. But we need solutions. That's where we need to go, because we are spinning around here, and we really need to buckle down and focus on solutions and how do we implement these things and be intentional. So I want to thank you so much for your time, sharing with us quite an interesting conversation. And we want to wish you all the best as you continue to do your research, lectures, and as you know, inspire young lawyers and mediators and criminologists to really get involved and make a difference in our beautiful Twill Island Republic. So viewers,
thank you so much. Thanks for having me on this morning.
Yes, and thank you viewers for staying with us. We go for a quick break, and when we return, we have two gentlemen who will sit with me and will share something with you. So stay tuned. We'll be right back.